I brought my Bible today. I feel like one of those preacher men, with a Bible-thumping preacher men. We're going to preach from the Bible. I got called recently by a woman who was having an argument with her husband. And they were disagreeing over whether love is a choice or love is a feeling. Big question. How many think love is a feeling? Raise your hand. How many think love is a choice? Yeah, pretty well evenly divided. All right. So probably lots of people are having that dispute. Maybe people mean different things by it. But I told her I think love is a choice. And I think that's sort of what makes Christianity. That it's a choice, sometimes in very hard circumstances that we have to face. And I think the gospel kind of hints at that today. We're in chapter 13 of St. John's Gospel. It's at the Last Supper. And we read toward the end of that chapter from the gospel today. And the words are almost exactly the words in the fourth Eucharistic prayer just before the consecration. That when now the hour had come for Jesus to be glorified, and it's talking about the moments just before His suffering and death. It says in the fourth Eucharistic prayer, He gathered those He loved, and He loved them to the end. Chapter 13 of the Gospel of John starts with the washing of the feet, where before the Last Supper, Jesus goes and washes the feet of the 12 apostles. And you remember how Peter's shocked and he says, "No, Lord, you can't wash my feet." And Jesus says, "If I have washed your feet, you must wash each other's feet. I have done this as a lesson to you." And then it goes on, and it says that Jesus then, after He had washed their feet, became deeply troubled in His spirit, because He knew what was about to take place. And He says to the apostles, "One of you is about to betray me." And Peter motions to John, "Find out who it is." And Jesus indicates who it is by giving a morsel of bread to Judas. And He says to Judas, "What you must do, go do now." And it says, Judas went out, and Satan entered him. And then, ominously, the Gospel says, it was night. And Judas, as we know, goes off to hatch a deal with the Pharisees to betray Jesus. He is going to lead them to a private place where Jesus will be praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, because they hadn't been able to arrest Jesus in public for fear of the crowds. And so they had to find Him in a place where there were relatively few people, where Jesus would be practically alone. And Jesus goes and receives 30 pieces of silver for His betrayal. It was night, and Satan entered Him. And this is the build-up to what Jesus says. Once Judas goes out, Jesus begins to speak, as we heard. Now the Son of Man is to be glorified. And He's talking about His suffering and death. He'll be glorified in His suffering and death, because that's the act of perfect obedience and perfect love for the Father, who wills that Jesus die for the salvation of the world. And then he says, I leave you a new commandment. As I have loved you, you must love one another. And the meaning couldn't be more clear, is that Jesus is calling us to love even up to the point of sacrifice and death. To love each other that way. Because Jesus is about to go and model that behavior. That He will offer His life for us. And He says then, by the love that you have for each other, the world will know that you are my disciples. So Jesus is saying that it's that heroic, self-sacrificing love that ought to characterize Christians. That ought to be the distinctive mark of a Christian. That dying to oneself in all the circumstances of our life. Pardon me, but I don't think there's any philosophy of life or any religion in the world that offers such a high standard for love. Right? To live like Christ loved means to be willing to offer our lives for each other in love. And this is the heroism in love that we're called to. And sometimes we think about heroism only in terms of maybe running in a burning building to save somebody, or like that recent example, that kid in Colorado in the school shooting who charged at the shooter and was shot and killed so that the others could overcome the shooter before he did any more damage. That fellow's a hero. But those moments are so rare and probably will never happen in our lives. So that's not what we mean by heroic love. That's not the only way we love heroically. Jesus is saying, love heroically every day in our ordinary lives. It's not just for those unique special occasions that happen maybe once in a lifetime. I'm thinking about the people who persevere in love even after the romance is gone and there's been a lot of water under the bridge and a lot of hurt and a lot of pain, and they persevere in love. I think of the person who, with an elderly parent, continues to love and care for them, even though their life with that parent really hadn't been very good, that there had been conflict and abuse and manipulation, a lot of wounds, and yet they still love and care for that person in their old age. I'm thinking of the parent that has a kid who's an addict, and time again they go and they have to find a way to rescue them from themselves. I'm thinking of the mom with a special needs kid whose situation has deeply affected her life, and yet she perseveres. In all those cases, love isn't a good feeling. Love is a positive choice to love like Christ, even on the cross. Right? And that, I think, is what distinguishes Christianity from everything else that's out there. And that's what glorifies us. Like Jesus was glorified because He laid down His life for all of us. So where are we? That's what Christians do. And we might say, well, I'm not that strong. I don't have it in me to love like that. I'm just not made that way. I'm not that generous. I'm not that good. But I don't think it's just about what we're made of or the qualities that we have. I think there's another element here that we can't overlook. In this chapter 13 of St. John's Gospel, it's the beginning of the Last Supper, the washing of the feet. Then Jesus sends Judas out. And then Jesus talks about this kind of love, to lay down one's life for each other. And they will know you are my disciples if you do that. And then Jesus goes on, and He gives us the Eucharist at that meal. Jesus institutes the Eucharist, the sacrament of His body and blood. And He invites us to do it in memory of Him and to receive His body and blood. And that call to this new commandment of love and the Eucharist at the same time is the key to really understand how we get the ability and the power to love like that. Because to love like that is something that's supernatural. It's beyond our natural power to love. It's beyond our feelings. Because nobody in those situations really feels like loving that person. Very often they don't deserve it. Very often justice would say, turn your back on them. And yet that heroic love that Jesus talks about is possible because He gave us His body and blood. He feeds us on His very body and blood. And if we receive Holy Communion worthily and often, we receive a power and a strength to love beyond the human level, beyond the natural level. To give ourselves, even in sacrifice, even up to death. So there's no accident that Jesus instituted the Eucharist the same night He gave us that new commandment of love. Love one another as I have loved you. That's the new commandment. That's the one that goes beyond all the other commandments in Christianity. That's the one that sums up what Christianity is all about. That heroic love that's made possible by the Eucharist. And so when we receive the Eucharist, we should be praying every time, Lord, give me a heart that's more like yours. A heart that's sacrificial and heroic. Who can love people who don't deserve to be loved. Who can forgive people who don't deserve to be forgiven. Who can pour myself out for others the way you poured yourself out for me. And then, if we love like that, the world will know that we are disciples of our Lord Jesus Christ.